Hey Mambo, Mambo Italiano. Yes, it's the chart of Italy. And we're going to look at this because Italy are having a referendum this Sunday, the 4th of December. And so what a good time to see what the referendum may mean for Italy, which way it might go, and what 2017 is going to hold for Italy. Now, Italy is rather important because they've got quite a lot of debt, problems within their banking sector, and there's a lot of aggro with the Five-Star movement, who are also anti-globalist, anti-EU, rising up in the polls in Italy. So while we've had Brexit, we might have Nexit, they're talking about Swexit, Drexit. With Italy, we're calling it Quitily, because otherwise it doesn't really work. So quit the EU, Quitily. Now, as you can see, this is the chart for Italy, and it's set for the 10th of June 1946, which is the chart for modern Italy, because obviously Italy as a concept, as a country, has been around for centuries. So this is modern Italy. It is Scorpio rising, Sun in Gemini. So this is a really interesting combination of influences, because with Scorpio we've got all the mystery, sort of secretive, transformative. With Gemini we've got something that's really erratic, quite unpredictable, sort of fence-sitting. So that's probably why Benito Mussolini said that it's not impossible to govern the Italian people, it's merely useless. And I can see why, because it's such a complex blend of influences here. So if you've watched my readings quite often, you may be looking at this chart and getting just a hint of déjà vu. Whose chart does this look like? Well, if we twist it around like that, and instead of all the planets sitting between 9 and 3, we have the planets between 6 and 12, whose chart have we got? Donald Trump. Yeah, because Donald Trump is born just 4 days later than Italy. Now, a week is a long time in politics, and 4 days is quite a long time in astrology, but it is rather interesting. Now the focus has shifted from Donald Trump, sort of at the beginning of November, and now the focus is going to Italy, and they have such similar charts. And as you will have seen in Donald Trump, I talked a lot about the Sun and the North Node, and those are two themes that are also going to be looked at when we look at the Italian chart. So, what we want to talk about first is, what is this referendum really all about? Now, when I think of this referendum, I think of going to the fun fair. You can either go to the Hall of Mirrors, or you can go on the ghost train. And on both of them, it's rather confusing. It's full of illusion, lots of surprises. You don't really know what's what. And when you come out the other end, you think, what the focaccia was going on? So this referendum has a lot of elements. The first one is, they're going to be one of the reforms that are in the referendum is to change the balance of power between the upper and the lower house. There's also some interesting things in this referendum about changing the balance of power between regional and central governments. But the most important thing about this referendum is electoral reform. Now, at the moment, the way the Italian system is set up is it gives rise to a lot of coalitions. So they want to change the elections so that the people, because in Italy they have 2 rounds, similar to in France, not how we do it here in the UK or the US. So they want to give the party who gets a lead in the first round an automatic advantage in the second round, so that they can get a party with a clear majority and a mandate to rule, rather than having to worry about coalitions. So I'm quite interested in that, because the experts seem split on whether this would give an advantage to the Five-Star movement, the populist movement, or not. It seems to me it might, so I'm not quite sure why they are pushing for this. Maybe when they devised it sort of 2 years ago it seemed like a good idea, but right now I'm not sure if it would be, because it would give impetus to Five-Star if they did really well in the first round. And I'm not sure if the powers in the EU would really like that. But as I say, the jury's out on whether that would happen. But I think most of the people, when they go to the polls, are not going to be caring about any of those issues. Because as we've seen now, the vote is the last bit of power most people have, and they will use it to give the establishment a kicking. That's why the smaller parties in Italy, the opposition parties including Five-Star, are all pushing for a no vote, particularly because Matteo Renzi has put his reputation on the line. He sort of said, I'm going to resign if you get a no vote. So therefore it's really a referendum on whether you want Matteo Renzi to continue. However, it really isn't that clean cut, because if it gets a yes vote, all these reforms might not even happen, because the Constitutional Court can either throw them out totally, accept them, or modify them. And if it's a no vote, Matteo Renzi doesn't have to resign. If he does, his resignation may not be accepted. Or if it is accepted, it may not trigger an election next year. and someone else may step into the role. So you can see why I talked about the ghost train versus the hall of mirrors, because either way, you're not really sure about what you're getting the other side. One thing for sure is the banks are very edgy. They really don't like uncertainty. So for sure, if it's a no vote, the banks aren't going to be liking it. And that's why, one of the reasons why I think we are going to have a no vote, because transiting Pluto, which as you know is in Capricorn, is going to be squaring up to Jupiter in Libra, which rules the second house of banks and money. So it seems to me that the banking system is going to be really shaken up by this. So that begins to make me think that it's going to be no. But it's quite interesting to look at the chart of Italy, because it's not at all what you might expect. So with the Scorpio rising, they've also got Moon in Scorpio in the 12th house, and this is actually very similar to the Soviet Union. Now, I've discovered recently that Matteo Renzi and Italy in general have a really good relationship with Russia, and this might stem back to the power the Communist Party has had in Italy over the years. And that's typified by this sort of Scorpio rising, Moon in Scorpio. The Soviet Union was Sun in Pisces, a mutable sign, the same as Gemini, with their Sun in, same as Italy, with their Sun in Gemini. So, you know, if Matteo Renzi does win this referendum, undoubtedly we'll see claims that Putin rigged it for him, huh? So we also have, with Italy, Sun is conjunct Uranus. So Sun is symbolic of the leaders, leadership. Uranus, of course, is everything about change, sudden erratic change. And that's why Italians go through leaders like orange juice. I mean, you remember the joke when Chelsea was going through all those managers? They said only 9 Chelsea managers to go until Christmas. And it's a bit like that with Italy, you know. Only about 3 more Italian leaders to go until Christmas. They really do like to chop and change, and that is why they're having this referendum, really, because they want to stop that and make Italian politics more stable, and hopefully that'll shore up the economy for them. Now, what else you will notice in this chart is how many planets in this particular quarter. So this is what I would call a sunset chart. It is depicting a country in decline. So while the best years for Italy was in its infancy, as we say, born in 1946, we had a good time in the 50s and the 60s. By the end of the 60s, it was beginning to go into decline. We had the years of lead. Things have never really recovered. Manufacturing is in decline. They've lost so much of their industrial capacity, massive youth unemployment, huge amount of debt. I think that's all symbolized by the planets over here. Things are on their way down. How can they put that right? The other thing about the Italian economy is there's a huge bureaucracy. It's not very efficient, incredibly slow. Now the 11th house here is the house of the legislature, local government, regional government and the main government. And here you have Neptune indicating how it's very slow, it's extremely inefficient, it's not very transparent. Jupiter, there's way too much of it, it's too bureaucratic, and of course because of all of that, so slow moving. Now one of the hangovers from the influence the Communist Party had is that the labour market's extremely rigid. It's hard to hire and fire people. People get paid sometimes in excess of their productive level. That you see indicating there the Moon in Scorpio in the 12th house. Now the other thing about that is when you look back over the recent history of Italy, the modern history, there's been a lot of conflict between the left and the right, terrorism with the left and the right, sort of internally generated terrorism. That's typical of Moon in the 12th in Scorpio. Moon is all about the public, and there's a public very divided, inclined to uprisings, to protests, and sometimes in a case very violent ones, as we've seen in the many bombings, and I'll be coming on to that have taken place in Italy over the years. What we have in Italy as well is massive debt. As you know, debt is at 140% of GDP. And here we have all these planets in the 8th house, the 8th house of reliance on borrowing, on funding, on money from somewhere else. They're not really generating enough money, and that's depicted by the 8th house. And we're going to be coming back to that because a lot of 8th house themes are coming to the fore now. So I think it's a time of chickens coming home to roost. So while Italy have always been able to manage their economy with this huge amount of gearing debt, that may be coming to a head now, where it really has to be tackled and changed for the better. Now, with the Scorpio rising, you'll know Scorpio is kind of secretive, and Italy is apparently 65th out of 189 countries when it comes to transparency, and also 69th out of 175 in terms of ease of doing business. And that's because in Italy they don't like major change. They like tinkering around the edges, which I think is typical of the fact that their sun is in Gemini. They sort of resist major change. They like little changes here and there. But this referendum would mean, you know, something, perhaps moving to a greater change, but will they want it? I'm not sure. Another thing you see here, we have Mars in Leo, Pluto, who is the chart ruler, also in Leo. And that says to me that the economy is dominated by some self-congratulatory and self-perpetuating salons and dynasties, you know, Fiat and the really big companies. And as the economy has gone into decline with the banking, it's very hard for small and medium businesses to get funding, whereas the big multinationals who have access to the global capital markets are still able to get funding. They're becoming stronger, the rest of the country kind of becoming weaker. You see there, the midheaven is in Virgo, which says to me that modern Italy has aimed their economy more at luxury goods, designer goods, very high quality, high specification goods. Like, you know, for example, if you go to Marks and Spencer in the stores, you'll see made in Italy. It's a sign of kind of quality and great design. Yeah, sure, they're cars as well, but I've got more experience of Marks and Spencer than the luxury end of the market in terms of cars. So, but they haven't really moved, but what at the expense of moving towards the luxury market is the manufacturing of mid-level cars has all been sort of shipped out to other countries, which similar to we saw Donald Trump talking about the decline in the Rust Belt states and in Michigan. Yes, Italy is suffering that as well. So they've got a lot of problems structurally in their economy, definitely with the debt, and now we're going to start looking at how the planets are influencing them right now. So I talked about Pluto here, which is squaring up to Jupiter. Quite a lot going on there, because Jupiter is in the house of the legislature, Jupiter is all about the law, and Libra, the sign that rules the 11th house, is all about the balance of power. So that typifies everything, really, that this referendum is about. Nigel Farage called it a power grab, so I think some people could interpret it in that way, but it is looking to change the whole structure of power between regional, local, upper house, lower house, and how the electoral reform goes on. So the fact that Pluto is affecting Jupiter could actually say that this reform might go ahead because that's indicated. But it also could say that it's going to cause a lot of chaos and turmoil in all those sectors of government. So what we said again about the ghost train, either way, you're not really going to know. The other interesting thing about Jupiter is it represents borders. So I see that becoming a crisis in terms of the immigration coming off the Mediterranean through Libya into Italy. I see that coming to a head. One other thing that Jupiter represents is the weather. So I want to come back to that later because I think we might be seeing some extreme weather in Italy going into the next year. And of course, as I talked about, Jupiter is ruling the second house of banks. So I see the banks getting extremely jittery, wobbly, and entering a crisis phase after this referendum, which on that count makes me think it's definitely going to be a no. So what else are the planets doing? Now Uranus, transiting Uranus, is going through Aries over here, and it's squaring up to Venus and Saturn in Cancer. Again, those planets are in the 8th house. Venus and Saturn represent business, Venus represents debt. So I think that Italy is reaching a crisis point in terms of all this debt. They are going to need more funding. What else? Venus governs the 7th house of treaties. And we know that already Italy has been going against some of the agreements in terms of their EU conditions. And that's because with Pluto squaring Jupiter, Italy are rejecting austerity. They really want to move away from that. But that's putting them on a collision course with Germany, which is represented by Uranus interrupting their relations in terms of their 7th house relations. The other thing is, they have tried this electoral reform before and had referendums on it. One of the referendums, which was a total disaster, that happened in 1993, when that happened, Uranus was conjunct Venus. So we're seeing a repeat of that planetary pattern during a time when a referendum was a disaster. So that leads me to think that this referendum won't be particularly successful. for Matteo Renzi. And incidentally, if you look at Matteo Renzi's chart, he's a Capricorn. He has Pluto square his Saturn. These planets weren't very well placed at birth. He's also got Saturn square Neptune, which is in his 10th house, and he's got Uranus square Sun. So when you look at all those, it doesn't look particularly positive from his chart in terms of the influences he's under. He's under an enormous amount of pressure. The fact that Neptune's indicated here means he probably regrets ever calling this referendum, because it's ended up, or maybe he regrets saying that he'd resign if he didn't win it, because things have really changed massively after Brexit and the Trump win, making this election look like a dead cert for going no. Okay, now let's have a look at what else we've got there. We have what else should we talk about? Well, I do want to come back to the fact that the Sun and the Node have now moved by solar arc and are on the midheaven, because this has been very significant in the history of other countries. So I want to have a look at the other countries and what was going on with those countries when the Sun or the North Node was on the midheaven, because that could be quite indicative of things to come. And I think the fact that the North Node in the 8th house is moving to the midheaven tells me chickens are coming home to roost in terms of this extremely high level of debt, and there is something about this debt is going to have to be addressed in terms of getting a bailout or getting some injection of cash. Something important is going to happen with the debt. That's why, like the eyes of the world were on Donald Trump, the eyes of the world going into 2017 are going to be on Italy, because they're going to be the linchpin now, watching the 5-star movement. Will we have Quitely, and what will happen with the Italian banks, and could Italy drag the world into a worldwide recession? As I said with America, it looks like financially things are going to be very tricky in 2017, and I said in that particular vlog, is it Italy that's going to drag everyone down? And it looks like the way the whole focus is on Italy, that could very well happen. Now, the other interesting thing, I think we're going to look back in the past in Italy to see when these sort of patterns were going on. Now, back to Pluto square Jupiter. When else was that happening? Well, it was happening in 1979. That was part of the years of lead. It was a time in Italian history of extreme political, economic turmoil, social turmoil, and 1979 and 1980 were characterized by a massive amount of assassinations. Now, because Neptune was affecting the Sun at that particular time, that's probably why the assassinations were happening. So I don't think we'll see a repeat of that, but I do think we are going to see a repeat of the economic and political turmoil that was represented by the years of lead. Now, another time when Pluto and Jupiter were affecting each other in the chart was in 1969. That was the beginning of the years of lead, when things really went into decline for Italy in terms of economy and politics. Quite a few more significant things I'd like to talk about in terms of the 1969. That was when there was a far-right bomb in Milan, in the Piazza Fontana, and there was also what was known as the Hot Autumn, which led to occupations of factories and different businesses. A lot of industrial action going on. So one of the themes for Italy, I think, going into 27 is a repeat of strong industrial action, possibly even more of the kind of politicized kind of activism that was so characteristic of the years of lead. Now, in 1979, there was also the Bologna massacre, which was a neo-fascist massacre. 80 were killed, 200 injured. So unfortunately, we are seeing quite a lot of pointers now in this chart to times in Italy's past where there were uprisings. Now, with the solar arcs, I see that solar arc Mars is going to be conjunct Moon in Scorpio. Now, at the beginning of the chart, I talked about how Moon in Scorpio, and I related it to what Benito Mussolini said about how it's just merely useless governing the Italian people. So I see the Italian people really standing up for themselves and saying, no, we've had enough. Now, the Moon in the 12th is all about populism, populist, the public opinion. And again, I think that could benefit the 5-star movement, because Mars is energizing this whole popularism and also with the sun coming onto the midheaven, that's all about nationalism. So I see definitely a revival in populist politics, in nationalism. I see this as favouring the five-star movement, and I think they could grow stronger. But because Moon is in Scorpio, I think that things are going to be becoming increasingly contentious and very divisive. So I see people splintering off from the middle ground, becoming more far right, more far left. I don't think we can rule out violence or clashes or something like that going on because of the parallels we have to what was going on in the past. Now, we also have with Uranus, I talked about how Uranus, which is in Aries, is squaring up to Venus. That was also characteristic of a time in 1974, and during that time there was a train bombing at San Benedetto. There was also the Piazza della Loggia bombing, and that was when the Red Brigades, who were a kind of far left movement, were formed. So again, here's this theme of far left, far right becoming far more active and more extreme. So with this whole activation of Scorpio, yes, I think Italian politics will become more extreme, possibly more explosive. So you will remember earlier I said I talked about Jupiter and Jupiter ruling the weather, and I said that's something we could come back to. Well, when the solar arc Mars was last connecting up to Moon was in 1976, when there was a disastrous storm which led to floods in Venice. So when we look at other countries as well, we see that often when the node moves up to the midheaven, there can be natural disasters and things like floods. So we're going to be looking out for that in Italy. I believe that there's a volcano only 10 kilometers from Rome, which after many, many years is suddenly beginning to rumble. And we've seen just in the last month, incidentally, when the North Node was transiting this time, the midheaven, that we had earthquake in Italy, and I think that's probably the second one this year. So there's definitely going to be more of that kind of seismic activity going on in Italy as well with the possible floods. So there's definitely, or again, sun on the midheaven, all this focus on Italy. Italy is going to be in the news for a lot of reasons. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to all of them to be very positive. Now, when the solar arc sun was on the midheaven was the time of the TWA crash, which was also something in Italian history, so another thing that we'll be looking out for. One of the other years that showed up, when this was in, as a matter of fact, when the North Node was affecting the midheaven, was in 1965, and people might remember Piano Solo. It was a paper coup. It actually wasn't a proper coup as it came out later, but it was a, what would you call it, a propaganda coup, where the it was really a hoax to kind of sway coalition talks. So again, that speaks to me of this whole political turmoil. Nothing is going to be defined. So if Matteo Renzi thought that having this referendum was going to lead to a position with the electoral reform where there'd be more certainty, more stability, I think we're going to get the exact opposite of that. It's just like a pressure cooker of things going on in Italy that all seem to be coming to a head this year. So I wanted to talk about these planetary influences, particularly the North Node and the Sun in the midheaven, and to talk about how they've affected other countries over the years, because they've been quite significant. So one of the countries that I'm talking about is the United Kingdom. As we know, United Kingdom was born in 1801, so it gives us a long history to look back on. And they had their North Node conjuncting the midheaven in 1886, 1887. That was a time of rioting in the West End, and guess what? The coldest winter in 30 years. So there's this kind of extreme weather thing coming up in the chart again. It was also a time when there was rioting in Belfast, quite a lot of problems with the Orange Order. So again, in the UK, when the North Node came to conjunct the midheaven, a lot of civil unrest, a lot of people getting quite angry, wanting to strike or riot, this sort of intensity of feeling. When in the United Kingdom the solar arc sun came up to the midheaven, that was when Margaret Thatcher came into power. Now, we have François Fillon in France. He's now one of the lead contenders going into their presidential election. He says he's a big fan of Margaret Thatcher. And so I'm looking and thinking, maybe someone like Margaret Thatcher is going to emerge to kind of pull Italy out of this. Because of course Britain was known as the sick man of Europe, had a terrible time in the 70s. This led to, Margaret Thatcher. So I wonder if this period in Italian politics and economic history is going to lead to the birth of a similar person, a Thatcher, coming into power in Italy. We don't know. So in Syria, when their north node was on the midheaven, they had a coup. So here again, it's this whole political turmoil theme going on. In China, actually, it was when their south node, slightly different, so a little bit more extreme, when their south node was on the midheaven was during Tiananmen Square. So again, we have the theme of the public rising up, public anger, public outrage, the public kind of being audacious in the way they stand up to government. In the United States, when we had the similar thing, again at the North Node on the midheaven, it was a time of Nate Turner's slave rebellion, and it was also at the time in 1832 of the Black Hawk War. Those were similar periods. And the interesting thing in the USA was, just after the North Node conjuncted the midheaven, their Pluto was squaring up to Jupiter when they had the Panic of 1837, which was a financial crisis leading to a major recession. It was 1837, so that was, quite a long time ago. So in Egypt, when they had a similar thing going on, it was the War of Attrition, proclaimed by NASA. So I don't think Italy is going to be, going into a war or anything, but again, you can see political turmoil. In Argentina, when they had a similar thing, now of course, we know Argentina is quite a good example to look at because they, similar to Italy, have always had a lot of debt, quite a lot of financial problems. When they had the North Node conjuncting the midheaven, they had a lot of inflation, they had capital flight, they had some elections, and in fact they had someone come into power who said they were going to kick out corruption, stop fraud in the government, and they really weren't very successful at doing it. It proved just too much, and Argentina during that time went into a period of absolutely very poor economic results. It was called the infamous decade. So here we have in Argentina the infamous decade, and we see parallels in Italy's chart back to the years of lead when there was all this economic turmoil. So it's not really a very happy picture, but then of course all of us knew this was going to kind of explode sometime, all this debt. In Japan, when they had the similar thing in their chart, it was the time of Korea getting independence from Japan. In Thailand, quite interestingly, when they had North Node on the midheaven, it was a time relating to the film Bridge Over the River Kwai, when 80,000 to 100,000 civilians died, and also 13,000 prisoners of war died building that bridge. So you can see that every time the North Node is connecting to that midheaven, it's quite a significant, but also possibly a bloody and turmoil time in the country's history. Last example I have in Spain, when they had it, it was their bloodiest year in terms of ETA terrorist bombings. So you can see this is not a time in history that's going to be particularly calm. So overall, as I'm looking at it, I think Italy will be in focus. The eyes of the world are going to be on Italy. It's a very important time in their history. Hopefully it's a time when they can take really brave steps to change things, particularly with the debt. But the debt is absolutely in focus. The banks are very jittery, they're in focus. It's going to take a very strong leader to come and pull this out the fire. And the public aren't going to be very patient. They're going to be vocal, loud. They're going to be showing their displeasure, particularly at the ballot box. So looking towards Sunday, I think it is going to be a no. As we know, that doesn't necessarily mean anything because Matteo Renzi might not have to step down, but I think it could usher in a new wave and possibly give Five Star more impetus, or give all the parties that are becoming more far left or far right more impetus, because the Italian people are now very impatient. They do not like the way things are going, and they are going to be heard. So it really got quite complicated that there was a lot of information to go through, a lot of examples of other countries' charts and influences. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm going to be watching with great interest to see what happens on Sunday and what happens the coming year for Italy. All eyes on Italy.